Brother Massacre.
It is nice to be with you this evening. We appreciate your presence. We hope and pray that our God will lead us into greater understanding and knowledge of His words. We are studying the third epistle of St. John. Tonight's topic is supporting ministers of the gospel, taken from verses 5 through 8 of the epistle, that is the third epistle of St. John. It contains only one chapter. In writing to Gaius, John has referred to his joy of hearing that Gaius is walking in the truth. Verses 3 and 4. An area of Gaius' life in which this was especially true was in showing hospitality to traveling ministers. Verses 5 through 8 read thus: Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers, who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well. Because they went forth from or for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. This is an interesting passage of scripture. And as we move forward with this lesson, we will notice what is interesting about John's letter to Brother Gaius. When one reads 2 John, he will notice what John called the danger of receiving and supporting those teachers who do not proclaim the doctrine of Christ. Verses 9 through 11 of 2 John, which also contains only one chapter, John wrote, Whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this gospel or this doctrine, do not receive him into your house, nor greet him Godspeed. For he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. But you will observe here in 3 John, we learn of the good that can be done when we receive and support those involved in the spreading of the gospel. In this study, we shall consider 2 main points. First, the scriptural authority for supporting ministers of the gospel. And 2, the reasons given by John for why we should be willing to do so. We will go outside of our text to other portions of Scripture so we can learn what not only John taught Gaius, but what Jesus, the Apostle Paul, and others had to say on this important subject. So let's dig in. The spiritual authority for supporting ministers. Jesus himself was dependent upon others for support as he went about preaching the gospel. Take note of Luke chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. Now it came to pass afterward that he went through every city and village, preaching and bringing the glad tidings of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, whom he had cast out 7 devils, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who, notice, who provided for him from their substance. So as he went about preaching and teaching, of course he was human then, and needed the very same thing that every minister today needs: food, shelter, and other necessities. And who provided those things? Susanna, Mary, and others. But also notice in Matthew chapter 10 and verses 5 through 10. These 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them, saying, Do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Take note of verse 9. Provide neither gold nor silver nor copper in your money bags or belts, nor bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor staffs. For a worker is worthy of his food. In a nutshell, Jesus was telling them, you are on a mission for God, and you are entitled to all material necessities like your fellow brothers and sisters. Because Jesus concluded, a worker is worthy of his food. On another instance, we are told in Luke 10, verses 1 through 8, Jesus again sent his disciples on a mission to preach and spread the glad tidings of the gospel. And so the record said, after these things, the Lord appointed 70 others also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go. Then he said to them, the harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Does that sound familiar? Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your way. Behold, I sent you out as lambs among wolves. Carry neither money bag, sack, sandals, and greet no one along the road. But whatever house you enter, first say, peace to this house. And if a son of peace is there, your peace will rest on it. If not, it will return to you. And remain in the same house, eating and drinking such things as they give. For the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not go forth from house to house. Whatever city you enter and they receive you, eat such things as are set before you. It was a different occasion to the first passage we read in Matthew chapter 10, but actually the same instructions were given. They were messengers of God, servants that were sent out to spread the glad tidings of the gospel. The message here is that as ministers, they were entitled to be supported, to be taken care of, because they were laboring on behalf of God's people. Taught by Paul the very same sentiments, although for personal reasons, he generally chose not to accept support. Paul defended the right of supporting ministers. So sometimes some ministers may choose rather to work secularly and earn their own living. And many of them have good reasons not to take support from a church, a congregation. But because they chose to work secularly does not mean they are not entitled to be supported by the church. Listen to him as he reasoned with the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 3 through 14. My defense to those who examine me this day: do we have no right to eat and drink? Well, unfortunately, some congregations feel that the preacher or the minister has no right to eat or drink, because often they expect free labor. You know, today's generation, they like everything free. But when they go to work, they expect payment, because they have to pay their rent, they have to eat, they have to send their kids to school, and many other expenses. And they expect payment, and rightfully so. But at the same time, and in the same way, when a preacher comes and preaches the gospel to a congregation, when he is hired to teach and preach and lead a congregation, he has the same right that we have when we work secularly. So Paul was asking, do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war at his own expense. In other words, he was asking, who you think that pays the U.S. Army? The soldiers themselves, they pay themselves? No, the government sent them out. The government has a right to pay them. Okay? So, whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man? In other words, he's saying, is this just my opinion? Or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. What will happen to that ox if you don't feed the ox? How can it work? Is it ox God is concerned about? Verse 10. Or does he say it altogether for your sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threads in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partakes of the offering of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. What a passage. Every congregation has a responsibility to support its minister or ministers. When someone devotes his time, his life in doing God's will within a particular congregation, he is entitled to be supported. And this is not just in reference to what we call the minister. It is the right of every minister. A minister is a servant. Anyone who devotes his time doing God's work is entitled to be supported for the work he does. And who ought to support him? You and I, members of that congregation. Oh, we understand sometimes you cannot fully support a minister. I know that. But we are discussing the fact that if you are able to fully support the minister or to support the minister on a part-time basis, if he chooses to work with that congregation on a part-time basis, he's entitled. He's entitled. He may choose not to accept support because he thinks that what he is earning outside is sufficient. But that is his prerogative. The church where he preaches and teaches, where he leads, should and must support the minister or the ministers in the sight of God. So here we have from 1 Corinthians 9, 3-14, Paul establishing the fact that ministers are entitled to be supported by the church. Just as soldiers are not expected to support themselves, just as farmers and shepherds enjoy the fruits of their labors, just as the law illustrated with the command not to muzzle the ox that feeds out or that threads out the grain. Brethren, from the principle of reasonableness, if one sows spiritual things, is it a great matter to reap material things? From the example of those serving in the temple who could partake of the offerings of the altar, even the Lord himself commanded those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel. We could stop right here. And I believe we should all understand and accept inspiration that every congregation has the responsibility of supporting his minister, of supporting their ministers. Paul said, I did not accept support from churches because if I do, I would have no reason to boast. So he gave up his right fully and freely. Because he was entitled to be supported by the Corinthians. As a matter of fact, one time he told the Corinthians, I rob other churches, taking wages from them to do your work. And that wasn't really right. In other words, it is leaving us the impression that Corinth could have supported Paul's ministry. But they had so much problems in Corinth. Paul did not want to make his ministry void. And so he chose to go and work secularly to support himself, lest he be accused of working for money. You know, we don't talk too much about giving because we fear unlearned and ignorant brothers and sisters may want to accuse us of working or laboring for money. You know, we've seen clearly that it's not a matter of laboring for money. It's a matter of working so as to support our needs and support the needs of our family. Like every other Christian, the minister has a wife. The minister has a house he has to pay for. He has utility bills like everybody else. He has to buy insurance like all of us. In other words, he has the same expenses that other Christians have. So must he starve and his family starve while he is doing your work. Another passage by Paul suggesting the scripturalness of supporting teachers. Hear him in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 6. Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. In other words, when someone teaches you the Holy Scriptures and, of course, other matters in life, Paul is advising the Galatians to share with your teacher in all good things. That's what he's saying. Because he is giving you spiritual food, you are entitled to give him material food. So with the approval of Jesus and his apostle Paul, there should be no question about the scripturalness of supporting ministers of the gospel. But let's go back to the text of 3 John 5 through 8. We find that John gives us 6 reasons that ought to motivate us to support our ministers. Scriptural motivation for supporting ministers. Number one, it is a testimony to our faithfulness. John wrote to Gaius, he said, "Beloved, you do faithfully." Verse 5. You do faithfully. When we show hospitality to brethren and ministers, it demonstrates faithfulness to the teachings of Christ and his apostles. Because those who labor spiritually should receive a wage in material things. We saw that. Number two, it is a testimony to our love for one another. John said of those who had received Gaius hospitality that they had borne witness of your love. Gaius was doing the giving here. He was taking care of ministers, traveling ministers, giving them housing, food, and other necessities as they passed through. Notice he did that not only to the ministers, but he did that also to other brethren. Look at verse 6. Who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well. When I read this passage, it touches my heart. And water flowed from my eyes like a river. Because I remember when I left Bible school with my new wife, I went not to my home village, I went to the city. I had no financial support. After a few months, we realized that our first kid was coming into the world, an added mouth to feed. And it was two beloved sisters in the congregation, small congregation with just a few members. And two sisters came to our rescue. They gave us a contribution every month. Not what we really needed, but it was very, very helpful because we had nothing coming in. And it is no joke when you have a responsibility upon your shoulder, not only to take care of yourself, but your wife and your kids. There were times I had to go and hide outside and weep like a child, because there I was leading a new congregation and could not materially provide for my family. It is the toughest thing you can ever face. Up to this day, and I'm sure throughout my entire life, those two sisters who came to my rescue, I can never forget them. Brothers and sisters recognized the work that Brother Gaius was doing, receiving brethren as they pass his way, providing for them food, housing, and of course, other necessities. To the extent, John says, the church, the brethren have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner befitting God, you will do well. Oh, there are some of our brethren who we can refer to as Gaius. They help their ministers. They help their brothers and sisters, especially those who are traveling. Because they recognize and appreciate the work that ministers do for the church. We demonstrate that we are keeping that new commandment first given to us by the Lord himself. John 13, 34, 35. When Jesus talked to his disciples about the new commandment, he gave them that they love one another as he has loved them. In light of the value of such love, notice what Jesus says, by this all will know. So, in light of the value of such love, we ought to be grateful for opportunities to bear witness of our love for our brethren. The third thing John says in the passage before us is that when we support our ministers, we honor God. John makes reference to sending such ministers on their journey in a manner worthy of God. Worthy of God means as befits God, that we listen to God. Thus, the way in which we support ministers of God can be a reflection upon God himself. Because if we do not consider his faithful ministers worthy of support, what do we think of God himself? If we honor and support those servants who faithfully proclaim his word, it is because we honor and respect the one they serve. In the fourth place, John says, another reason why we should support our ministers. It is a testimony to the lost. You see, the ones Gaius was encouraged to support were those who were taking nothing from the Gentiles. You notice verse 7? Because they went forth for his name's sake, for God's name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. Now, this means, brothers and sisters, they would not solicit support from the unsaved. They depended instead upon their brothers and sisters. When ministers of the gospel solicit help from those who are lost, they are trying to save, it sends a bad message. In other words, when ministers start asking unbelievers for help to support them in their work, it sends a bad message. You know what the unbelievers think? Perhaps the ministers are in this business just for money. If what they taught was worth anything, why don't their own fellow brothers and sisters support it? That's what they'll say, you know. If what the ministers are preaching was worth anything, why don't their own followers support it? When the gospel is offered free of cost, being supported wholeheartedly by those who know it best, it can be a powerful testimony of the value we place on it. Number 5, it obeys God. John, by inspiration of the Spirit of God, tells us we therefore ought to receive such. Verse 8. Thus, supporting ministers of the gospel is not only an opportunity, but an obligation. We therefore ought, that's the word John used. You recall the passage we read a while ago, Galatians 6 and verse 6. Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. So exchange of material things for spiritual things considered reasonable by the Apostle Paul. Hear what he's told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 11. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? There's a passage also in Romans chapter 15, 26 to 27, where the apostle said, "For it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. It pleased them indeed, and they are their debtors." That's strong. They are their debtors. The Jerusalem church is indebted to the Macedonian brethren. For if the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to take care of their material things. Last but not least, John taught us from verses 5 through 8, especially verse 8. John says, "It makes one a fellow worker for the truth." So, as he concludes, that we may become fellow workers for the truth. When we support a teacher, a minister, we become co-workers in what they do. If we support teachers of error, we share in their evil deeds. So said John in 2 John verses 10 and 11. But when we support teachers of the gospel, we have fellowship in their work. You remember the Apostle Paul telling the Philippians that they were fellow workers, because one of the congregations that supported the work, the ministry of the Apostle Paul, was the church at Philippi. But hear what he says: "I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making request for you of joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now." The word fellowship here means their support, their material support, their financial support to the Apostle Paul. Over in chapter 4, 15 and 16, he said, "Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving." What a shame. "But you only, Philippians. For even in Thessalonica, you sent aid once and again for my necessities." There are people who cannot travel to preach the gospel in other lands, in other countries. But when a person who cannot go himself contribute towards the minister's mission overseas, whether it be crusades, workshops, lectureships, or whatever advances the gospel, they are sharing in the labor of the minister who have gone overseas to preach. Even in your own country, when a minister preaches the gospel, whether it be in your congregation or in the congregation, a congregation elsewhere in a village or town, and you are the one who supports the minister financially, materially, you are sharing in his work, because without your financial support, he could not go. So as co-workers, we will one day enjoy the same reward. That our ministers, our teachers receive. So I quote on the last passage of scripture, Matthew 10, 40, 42. He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. He who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. So, brethren, in closing, we not only have the scriptural authority for supporting ministers of the gospel, but many reasons to do so. The rapid spread of the gospel and growth of the early church was facilitated by such people as Gaius, along with brothers and sisters like Aquila and Priscilla, who allowed the churches to meet in their homes. Philemon, who let the church meet in his house and could be called upon without hesitation to provide lodging for the Apostle Paul. Today, as walls tumble down that once stood preventing the free course of the gospel, there is still a need to support those who preach the gospel. You and I know very that there is a scarcity of gospel preachers. In today's time, gospel preachers rather go and work secularly than to preach the gospel for a lifetime. And they have good reasons. Because we church members have become stingy as far as God and his work is concerned. We spend our money on everything else, vanity of vanities, but scarcely give a dollar towards the work of the kingdom. And so churches cannot support their ministers, cannot do God's work, because members of the church will not contribute as they should for the preaching of the gospel of Christ. It's a shame and a disgrace. You hear congregations saying all over the place, we just cannot find a good preacher. Well, it's our fault, isn't it? Because not only we don't have money to support our ministers, but we ourselves think that our ministers should receive peanuts, while others would like to have a raise every fortnight, every 2 weeks. That I can leave and elaborate on another time. But brothers and sisters, may the spirit and liberality of Gaius fill the hearts of those Christians and churches who would be fellow workers for the truth. I know what I am talking about. I have been a minister for over 50 years. I was first supported for 25 years as a full-time minister. When I lost my support, I went into secular employment for myself. I was in my business for over 15 years, making a livelihood for myself and my family. And at the same time, I was still preaching full-time for the church for over 20 years, doing the same work I was doing when I was fully supported. I chose to support myself without depending on the church. But that did not mean that the church did not have a responsibility to support my work. I pray God that we will see the value of the gospel of Christ. We will recognize the fact that we are not going to take anything with us when we leave this world. The most important thing we can do is to support the spread of the gospel, build, edify, and strengthen one another. May God help us to love Him and to love the souls of the lost as we should. Brother Lenny.